we've had the sort of national experience in Germany and Sweden. We've had the British experience on the front. I'm going very local. And this talk is based on the material that we were gathered by a team of researchers, of which I was one. And we were researching the story of food in St Albans during the war. There were 11 of us officially on the team, but we were part of a larger group researching the story of the home front in general. And at various times, other people came across bits and bobs of information that they would email me. And this all finally came together in a chapter for this book. My chapter was called Feeding the City. And in fact, I won't embarrass her, but there's somebody in the audience who was part of this. And really, it was that sort of work that the people on the team made my life really much easier than it might have been. So my problem then was deciding how much to leave out of the final chapter. My problem today is a similar problem. So I do forgive me if what comes across is perhaps missing your favourite area. So just some background facts. In 1914, Britain was importing over 60% of its total food supply. And crucially, though, that figure was disproportionately represented amongst the working class diet because it's the chilled meat from Australia, which tended to be the cheaper cuts. 80% of our lard, 75% of our cheese was consumed in Britain's homes, came from overseas. And a statistic that gets trotted out quite a lot is that by 1914, only 1 loaf in 5 was being made from homegrown wheat. The nation was almost totally dependent on overseas producers for its sugar, much of which was particularly vulnerable to a continental war. 2/3 of the sugar used in Britain was produced by the sugar beet farmers of Germany and Austria, so you can see the problems there. There had been enough in the press in the years before the war sounding warnings, usually from farmers, that in the event of a continental war, getting enough food into the country would be a problem. So with those warnings in mind, you can imagine when war was declared, there was a rush to the shops and panic buying. And shelves emptied at an alarming rate, not helped by the fact that much of the food which was still coming into the country was being requisitioned by the army because they had to feed that huge volunteer army that was growing. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of misinformation and rumour flying around. Even before the internet, it was possible for stories to take off that could bring commercial ruin if believed. And this is an advertisement that I came across in the Hearts Advertiser. I'm slightly cheating. This is not, anybody who's looked at the Hearts Advertiser will think that's not from the Hearts Advertiser, because the Hearts Advertiser is an appalling paper in terms of quality of paper and print. But I can assure you, I got this off the British Newspaper Archive, and it's the advert, it's just from a better quality newspaper. So I saw this and I thought, well, they're banging the drum for Bovril. You know, they've gone to quite extremes here because they've listed the directors of the board. Why would you go to those problems? And these are all sort of what you might call the high and mighty. So we've got honourable here, and we've got another right honourable here. We've got an admiral. So what's going on? Well, it turns out that there were rumours going around that the board of OXO had Germans on the board. So here we have Bovril. Sort of, if you're going to buy one, you buy Bovril. OXO hit back with this. I mean, this is it just gives you a sort of sense of what's the high stakes that were going around at the start of the war. And advertisements in themselves, I'll come back to that right at the end, but advertisements in themselves, anybody who's researching the First World War, you know, that's a project in itself, just looking at the advertisements and how quickly advertisers start employing military language. It's really fascinating. So lots of rushing to the shops, some disturbances around the country, protests, and often police called in to restore order. We didn't find any evidence of such direct action in St Albans, but local traders were on the receiving end of a lot of sharp criticism in the papers for being too quick to raise prices. Shopkeepers in turn placed the blame for any shortages squarely on the shoulders of customers. The manager of one local grocery store reported that those who usually spent about a sovereign had given orders up to £5 or £10, which is a huge amount of money. And one gentleman had taken away in his motor car a dozen tins of tongue, 2 dozen tins of milk, 2 dozen tins of corned beef, half a side of bacon, 2 hams, 100 weight of flour, and other provisions, which gives you some idea of what was accessible for some people. But of course, fairness became an issue very quickly in the war. With food in short supply, prices rose, and in the first 2 years of the war, they rose by 61%. Now, wages did rise, so for those in work, wages did rise, but they couldn't keep pace with that sort of price inflation. And for those on fixed incomes, or perhaps women with caring responsibilities not able to take advantage of those new opportunities in factories doing war work, the situation was even worse. So customers blamed opportunistic retailers, retailers blamed wholesalers, wholesalers blamed the lack of food coming into the country. Small shopkeepers complained that they were penalised in favour of the larger chains, such as international stores. Larger chains in turn complained that they were hard hit by staff volunteering, where the small family-run business was not. And this sort of, you get this toing and froing. If you do look at the papers, you get this lot, self-justification for a lot of things. There were complaints about people hoarding. We have one case in St Albans of, this is in 1918, when there was an amnesty declared. So if you had hoarded food, you could bring it forward and no action would be taken. It could be, shared out. But the local newspaper didn't quite know what to make of somebody who had come forward with them. I don't know quite how many, but many, many tins of tripe. And unsurprisingly, nobody really seemed to want them. And the suggestion was made that they were donated to the local museum. We've been waiting, because the local museum in St Albans has been undergoing a huge refurbishment, and I keep waiting, for the email that says they found them. They found the tins of tripe. They're in the back of a cupboard. So there's lots, as you can imagine, lots of issues around fairness going on. In practice, what does this actually mean? There was food around. There was food around in the shops, but it was food that was costly. So if you could afford it, then you could perhaps buy some. It required queuing. And that's where somebody who had domestic staff might be better off, because they could send the downstairs maid to go and stand in the queue. So you can see there were these real issues around it. In autumn 1914, so quite early, we've got to wait till 1918 for rationing, but in autumn 1914, there was calls for a ceiling on prices. Something has to be done. So the government issued a sort of range of maximum prices. And these are held at Hertfordshire Archives, these two lovely posters. And the thing that strikes you again is that range of meat, which you would never see in this, in Waitrose now. A huge range of meats and different cuts of meat. And so these were the maximum prices. Well, of course, you can imagine the maximum price then becomes the normal price, doesn't it? So, of course, it fuels inflation even more. As I say, rationing didn't come in until 1918. There were some local initiatives across the country around 1917, because again, we have that same split that Margaret was talking about, where sort of post-1916, things do ratchet up quite a level. So by 1917, there were calls for rationing. This does happen in St Albans. They do call for it, and they discuss it in the local food control committee, but they decide that there is little point in printing thousands of cards for food that isn't available. The problem is distribution. The problem is getting the food into the shops, and that's their main criteria. And when rationing is introduced, finally, it's as much about reducing the threat of disgruntled people taking things into their own hands as keeping people fed. There was real potential, real concern in the government that these issues around food at home would spread to the army, because the story, the letters are going backwards and forwards, as we know. If troops on the front are anxious about families back home going hungry, what does that mean for morale? What does that mean in terms of control? So this is just one small poster that the Food Control Committee put out. This is in February 1918, so this is as rationing is coming in. And so households had to register. You had to register at a particular shop, and that would be for the various goods that were rationed. So here we've got butter, margarine and meat. But it's this bit that interests me, because this is about enabling smaller shops to obtain a share of the supplies and preventing congestion. Because for smaller family-run shops, they were at risk here, because if it's known that the larger chains are going to get the supplies in quicker, then you go and register with those. And so there's a sense in which the smaller St Albans shop is going to be struggling. And what they also don't want is everybody going to the same shops in the centre of the city, because, you know, again, we've got lots of people waiting for hours all in one place, and that might lead to civil unrest. So, in fact, on Christmas Eve in 2000, yes, 19, sorry. The Food Control Committee actually all went en masse and went to one of these chains and took away, they requisitioned the margarine that had just arrived and then distributed it across other shops, just so that other shops would have something to sell, and it avoided that problem of all these people queuing. So for the majority of the war, filling the shopping basket was what might be called, and I apologise for this, a hot potato. Much of our information on the food in St Albans came from minutes of the local Food Control Committee, which are not as dry as they sound. There's an awful lot of information there for local historians, but also local newspapers. And the tone in the newspapers is one which has been adopted from a government initiative, which is it exhorts people to avoid waste and tries to shame people who are seen to behave unfairly. In the first wartime editions of the paper, the tone is very much one of a sort of disappointment in those who have been seen to be behaving unfairly. The problem is not one of supply, it's of demand, and people such as our chap with the motor car taking away tins and tins of food, they're the real reason why there's not enough for all. But of course it depends on your point of view. For one person's panic buying is another person's prudent precaution to keep their family fed. It's where you draw that line. Women in St Albans, as women elsewhere, were seen as crucial to the success of the war on waste and were on the receiving end of a lot of advice on how to keep their households fed. So these are some government posters. I'm sure you've seen these sorts of things before. You know, this is something we haven't seen before. This is definitely, you know, the women are as crucial to fighting the war in the kitchen as any munitions worker or anybody else contributing to the war effort. You get lots in the paper addressed to women. So there's one syndicated piece that appeared regularly in the newspaper, which was called, in St Albans, it's called A Column for Ladies, Pen Pictures by Penelope, which always makes me think of something like Lady Isabel Barnett sort of sitting there. But what Penelope does is urge women to consider more imaginative meals. One article suggested 10 different ways to serve herring. Here we've got herring again. Although boiled with cabbage suggests a certain straining after new ideas. But it was interesting to hear that about herrings. Somebody was talking about herrings, that Norway was selling their herrings to us, and we suddenly have an enormous amount of herring because we don't want it to go to Germany. And I'd always wondered why herring, but there we go. So that's I've learnt something today, which has been fantastic. In St Albans, the council's Thrift Committee organised a series of lectures on cookery aimed at the wives of workers and cooks employed at the larger houses, the outcome of which they hoped would be a decided wave of economy in the kitchens of the city. A visit to the St Albans cinema in the summer of 1918 might have included the treat of a short Ministry of Information film called The Secret. And here we have a clip. Now, this tells the story of this poor man here, who is distraught at the size of the dumplings being served by his wife. He can't believe it. The marriage is under threat. She needs to do something, and she needs to do something pronto. This is the script that goes with it. And Mary Noggs is her neighbour. So what does she do? She goes and spies on Mary to see what Mary's doing. And the marriage is saved when she spies on her and learns the secret of her success, which is grated potato. And here we have... I mean, I just wonder what happens when the fork goes in. I have no idea. But anyway, so grated potato. Potato is, I think there's definitely a potato herring theme today. And so this is the sort of thing that's being put out. Now, just what women who'd been budgeting and preparing meals for years felt about all this advice and finger-pointing remains unknown, but I think we can hazard a guess. What it does tell us is that the authorities were very aware of how central to the war effort was the subject of food, and one which touched every home, although, as many were quick to point out, some homes more than others. So I just thought I'd give you a sense of some of the basic foods that you might have, to get a feel of what's going on in St Albans. So first of all, bread, which, as I say before, we've become very dependent on imported wheat for making our daily loaf. As farmers at home struggled to compete in the years before the war, many of them had switched into crops such as milk, potatoes and high quality meat because these were much less vulnerable to overseas competition. Farming is a long-term planning business, and there were a number of reasons why farmers did not switch crops to make up the shortfall. Growing cereals requires more labour than raising animals, so farmers were hardly like to switch at a time when so many of their workers were volunteering to join the army. And switching from one crop to another requires learning new skills and capital expenditure. And although it was clear the war wasn't going to be over by Christmas, it still made little sense to switch out of one crop such as milk or meat, which was holding up well and bringing in good returns and would continue to do so when the war ended. Why would you therefore switch to another which could leave you out of pocket and having to expend more money when the war was over? In late 1916, the government did intervene to force farmers to grow more wheat, which is another story. But for consumers, the reality was that bread became very expensive during the war. And again, it was that barometer, because it's such a central part of the working class diet, is a barometer for unfairness and shortages. So here we have more posters of women, not this time urged not to waste bread. From March 1917 onwards, bakers were not allowed to sell bread which was less than 12 hours old as a way of cutting back on consumption. It's a sort of a taste thing, but it's also a slicing. You can thin stale bread much slicer than you can slice fresh bread. Specific instructions were laid down on how bread should be manufactured, and the flour was graded with various ratios of flour to other substances such as rice, barley, semolina, rye or beans. And quality could be variable. This is a piece that appeared in the Heart's Ad in January 1918. And it gives you a sense of what some poor soul's struggling with his bread. So, again, where is it? I mean, I don't know. It could be. We haven't got it here. We couldn't serve it here. So, in March 1918, millers were authorised to add our old friend the potato to the mix. And a representative from the Ministry of Food visited St Albans to demonstrate to local bakers and millers how this could be achieved. The problem was they had trouble finding a potato wholesaler who was happy to take on the order. He had a good market for potatoes already. The ones they approached were already selling their potatoes. And there was a lot of red tape around getting anything paid, invoices paid. So they had struggled to find somebody who actually take this on. Wartime bread had a poor reputation amongst its customers. There were anecdotes of cutting the loaf and half a potato falling out. But the need to extract as much from the wheat as possible meant that actually it was more nutritious than much of the white bread which had been favoured before the war. If we look at milk, concerns around milk were predated the war. This was nothing new. There had always been concerns around hygiene, dilution. It's a very personal relationship between the sort of milkman and the customer. And there were frequent complaints in the papers through the war of the water being tasteless. It's being diluted so much there's nothing left. But the dilution of the milk, whilst annoying to customers, was not the worst problem to come out of the dairy. In November 1914, the owner of a local coffee tavern was summoned to answer a charge of selling milk to which a certain preservative had been added. The certain preservative in question was formaldehyde. And of course, apart from the danger it posed for itself, it also meant that it was impossible for the public health inspector to detect any underlying problems with the milk. The farmer who had supplied the milk testified that, yes, the milk was his, but he was struggling to keep up with orders from all the troops that were being billeted in St Albans, so he certainly didn't have any need to add formaldehyde to it. The farmer was cleared, the coffee tavern owner was found guilty and fined £5. But it got worse, because even more serious than the use of formaldehyde was the problem of tuberculosis bacteria. In early 1915, the inspector reported that of 10 samples taken from one herd alone, 9 had shown evidence of tuberculosis. When asked by one of the councillors whether a dark-coloured sediment in the bottom of a glass of milk would mean that it was tuberculous, the inspector answered, yeah. In spite of this, the price of milk rose steadily. But for those who were the dairy farmers, the price of feed, as you can imagine they're competing for that wheat, also rose very, very quickly. And some dairy farmers actually switched out of milk cows and moved into meat. So that, of course, in turn reduced the available milk. And whereas prior to the war, many of St Albans milkmen had also supplemented the local supply with milk from what they call rail milk. So this is milk that's coming down on the Great Northern Railway, and many of it is at Finsbury Park. There's a depot at Finsbury Park. But the local milkman complains to the council that he can't get this railway milk because the big wholesalers are now swooping in and taking what is available. And so he as a small producer is struggling. So, and that's a problem that continued for him throughout the war. So just a few things about St Albans. One way to supplement the diet was for people to grow more of their own fruit and veg, and we're going to hear from Hannah later, where Hannah is, about their allotment project. Allotments were an answer, but in St Albans it took quite a while for these to really get going. There were concerns about appearance and smells, with those early plots carrying a rule that no manure should be stored on the site, although that was relaxed later. The council also were hesitant about a call from the government to allow people to keep pigs. Their response was not to say no, but to say, well, we won't promote it, and if somebody asks, we'll talk about it. But there was, they were reluctant to actually take that on. But what they did do was mount a publicity campaign around growing more fruit and veg. The local parks superintendent was tasked with seeing this happen, and he worked his socks off, giving lectures, writing articles for the local paper, and also setting up a model plot in the local park to show residents how to do it. Whilst advice was given on how to grow lots of different types of veg, in practice it was our old favourite, the potato, which was the favourite. It produced a good crop, it took less time and effort to look after. But there was a sort of movement to encourage people to grow more. You could also make a small profit on it. So this is from 1917. So, we've picked all those berries and fruit and what have you at the end of the summer. And what you could do was you could make up a sort of package and label it up as yours, and then it would be sold, and then you would get a small amount of money back. So it avoids waste, because nobody can eat that many runner beans, and it avoids waste, and then you can share the food out within the community, but also you get a small return which encourages you to do it. So that's a sort of self-help thing which was going on, and there are other self-help initiatives. Soup kitchens, I'm sure you've all come across soup kitchens. This again was a feature before the war, nothing new there. Churches, chapels, the wealthy landowners would set up these within the town. And there were lots of charitable things on offer, usually run by women, and they filled a very large gap in many poor people's diets. They were evident in St Albans during the war. You can pick these up in the Food Control Committee minutes. But by 1917, there's a bigger initiative that's coming from the government, and that's called the National Kitchen. And this is a national kitchen. This is not St Albans, this is Westminster, but it gives you a feel for what's going on. It's a restaurant and a takeaway. And the St Albans one was only set up in October 1918, so we're looking at the end of the war, by the end of the war. They were quite slow getting going, because it did take quite a little time to set up. You had to get the kitchen, you had to get the premises, you had to get the equipment. There were loans on offer to help you get the equipment set up. So by October 1918, they have it up and running. There were complaints when the first committee was set up, because it consisted entirely of men. And that didn't go down at all well with the local suffrage society. And of course, they called for women to be added. The theory was behind that, and also by the Food Control Committee, which at the beginning had no women and then added women, was that all of this advice is going to women. They're much more likely to take notice of it if other women are involved. So women do start to make an appearance, although it's still male-dominated. Of course, it's women who are actually employed to do the dishing up and the cooking and to do the cleaning up. So customers had the option of eating in the restaurant or taking the food away. The menu that first day included barley soup, roast beef and milk pudding. A pint of soup would put you back threepence, that's 3D, and was one of the most popular takeaway items, together with fried fish and hot potatoes. There were long queues when it opened, and not everybody could obtain lunch. Presumably there's a lot of novelty value around this as well. And when the kitchen reopened in the evening, 400 suppers were taken away or consumed. The idea was that this was an economy of scale. So it's not just food that's a problem, it's fuel. You know, it's a waste, you don't want to waste fuel. So by offering this, they stayed open late enough so if you were working, you could come out of the factory, you could come out of wherever you were working, and you could get a hot meal. And for working mothers, it was a good idea because they could take something home with them and the children could have some hot food. So although it opened only 1 month before the war ended, rationing and food shortages, of course, did not cease, as we heard from Margaret. They did not cease with the signing of the armistice, and the kitchen continued to trade until 1920. So it gives you a sense of, you know, that there was a need. Now I'm just going to finish with something that this is just something I've shoehorned this in really, that it fit. It come from St Albans papers, that's my tenuous connection. Because when you read lots of papers, you start to pick up things, and I picked up, these are some advertisements for Freeman's Real Turtle Soup. And I started to spot these wherever I went. The one on the right is actually, I've just truncated that's just the top. This very delicate hand posting this, then this boiling water going in this dish, which I'm not sure would take it, and then this lady delicately sleeping it. But here we have Freeman's Real Turtle. It was proclaimed itself as the most delicious and nutritious soup, priced at 3d a tablet. It's set to a stiff jelly and was ideal for those who find the meat and bread allowance insufficient to maintain their usual strength. A plate of turtle soup enables you to eat less because you require less. And this thing just started to haunt me wherever I went. I'd see another advertisement. So, you know, it's a very fetching turtle, and it's made in Watford, which is interesting. So that was that. And then I found this beautiful photograph. This is not from the Heart's ad, you won't be surprised to know. And this is from the end of the war. And this is Delecta. And Delecta resides in Watford because she is the spirit of the Watford Manufacturing Company. And from her bounty, this is presumably Watford. Now, anybody who knows Hertfordshire will know this does not bear much resemblance. I don't know, is that the I don't know if that's the Cassio Bridge. Anyway, this does not bear much resemblance to Watford of today, or even 1918. But here she is, she's dropping her bounty, because as well as making chocolate and sweets and nibbles, as they put it, they also made Freeman's turtle jelly. And I like to think that this little bit here, I don't know, I reckon that's a slab of turtle jelly hurtling to the ground and knocking out the people of Watford. So anyway, thank you very much.